Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, my guest is Mateus, and I'll definitely have links to Mateus and everything kind of down below as well to where you can find him, just in case I kind of butchered his name and he didn't really understand my pronunciation there. But today we're going to discuss JavaScript as well as like some different rendering patterns and what it even means to render something and render something server-side versus client-side and all that stuff. But before we get to that, Mateus, could you just give me a little bit of your background on kind of what your stories look like regarding your tech career so far?
Cool. Hey, Ryan. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I've had like a lot of friends discussing interesting topics before here, so it's great to be here. So basically, I started back in 2012, 2013 in web development. I was doing mostly Angular, 1.1, 1.2, and Ionic. At the time, I was experimenting a lot with mobile. I also did a little bit of jQuery and PHP, Laravel, Symfony, those. And then I was kind of looking for something different. So for 2 years, I started doing native iOS. So I was in contact with Objective-C, Swift, Apple frameworks, that kind of stuff, which was interesting. But then I was like, no, I'm more a front-end person. So in 2016, 17, I went back to front-end, but this time I was like more focused on React. So I started really diving into the realm of React and everything in the ecosystem. And yeah, ever since I've been doing like React, TypeScript, or something close to that, like Next.js, Gatsby, etc. And in my company, Medallia, I'm focused mostly on three things: web performance, like measuring and optimizing performance and etc. We have like really high scale stuff, and also improving developer experience of legacy code bases, and last but not least, also tackling accessibility.
And is that kind of focus on performance what led you to kind of learn more about JavaScript rendering patterns and kind of that sort of thing?
Yeah, I would say so. Actually, my interest for web performance started when I started doing not only React, but also the iOS things. So I was always trying to, tackle some extra re-render that was like glitching the UI, that kind of stuff. And also to native browser stuff, like playing with web workers, etc. So I've always loved performance, and I usually join companies where I kind of see some challenge related to performance. And yeah, it's kind of a natural path to follow, digging into rendering patterns and that kind of stuff.
Maybe just one other quick question before we jump into rendering patterns. How do you feel about kind of the whole premature optimization topic when it comes to performance? Like, do you feel like a lot of people do premature optimization, or do you think maybe people should spend more time optimizing up front? Or how do you kind of balance that, spending a ton of time optimizing performance versus, just waiting until an issue happens and then trying to kind of backtrack and solve it at that point?
Yeah, that's kind of one of our huge depends that we would have here, but I've seen both happening. So I've been in places where, for example, about 4 or 5 years ago, I was working for this startup, and we're kind of like building like fancy stuff using latest version of React, latest version of Webpack, using some other optimization stuff. But then Next came out, and it was about Next version 3 of Next, and doing SSR was the cool thing, and etc. And then our CTO was like, you know what? We need SSR, and we didn't need SSR for that scenario. We didn't need the SEO. We didn't have issues with the first initial load, that kind of thing. We had no case for SSR, but it was the cool thing. So our CTO was like, okay, we're going to run this effort for a couple of months. And then it was actually bad because it wasn't bad for the performance, but we were using Redux, Sagas, and other stuff. And having that work well with SSR at the time, it was really challenging. So that was a really huge example of premature optimization that actually led to a maintenance cost. But I've also seen the opposite happen. So no one cared about performance until you had some huge client complaining because you needed that for a specific market. I want to say like Central America or Southeast Asia, like places where you have connection issues or lower end devices. And then you have to rush and gather all the metrics that you didn't get for years. So yeah, I've experienced both, and I kind of dislike when both happens, to be honest. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a balance there to where like you want to do your best up front to have like good performance and kind of architect things in a way that leads to good performance, but also trying to do like every single little thing to kind of optimize performance is probably also, not the best use of your time at that point. So I think there's definitely kind of a balance there. But kind of moving into the topic of today's discussion is different kind of rendering patterns. And the place I want to start is just first off, like what are we talking about when we say rendering? Like, I think a lot of people will talk about server-side rendering, client-side rendering, rendering on the edge, and this word is just kind of thrown around a lot, but I feel like often no one really kind of defines what it even means to render something. So what are we kind of talking about here when we say rendering?
Yeah, so actually, you're right. People are not often discussing this from a terminology standpoint, but basically I often see one broader definition in terms of general UI. So when you talk rendering, you're talking about displaying this a portion of data in a UI component. And I mean, it doesn't have to be a component like React does. And when you talk re-rendering, you're basically updating the data that you have in that UI components. And then if you think more React specific, then you kind of get this definition for a tunnel where you're talking about describing UI in terms of props and state and etc. And that's how the whole component-driven model of React was developed and etc. But that's it. You're plotting data to a UI, and re-render occurs when you have new data coming in. And each framework has like a specific process of rendering and etc.
Gotcha. And that kind of leads us nicely into client rendering versus server rendering. So what are maybe some key differences when people say that they are rendering something on the client versus rendering something on the server? And then maybe we can get into some maybe pros and cons of one or the other, kind of rendering on the client versus rendering on the server.
Yeah. There's a lot of discussions actually these days around MPAs versus SPAs and rendering in one versus rendering in the other. I think that a good place to start is to actually go a couple of years back in time. So we first had we had server rendering when we're like generating HTML for our page in the server side. And that usually happens in two ways. Either it happens at request time. So basically you're dynamically generating this HTML for each URL as you get the request. And that's what we got used to with things like PHP, Ruby, Java with JSP, .NET, etc. All of these are fully server-side rendered. And then after that, a few years later, we started also doing what's called pre-generation on the server side. But that was we were still using servers, but that happened at build time. So that's when we got the static site generators and terminology like SSG and etc. And that's in what you have here is the HTML pre-generated. The thing that happened, I mean, a lot of things happened, but in my opinion, one of the gotchas, and it was like, for me, one factor back at the time when I was doing PHP with jQuery and etc. was the developer experience for us doing front end wasn't great. So managing state wasn't great. A lot of things was just not great. And that's when we started doing more of what's called client-side rendering. That was when we had Angular, Backbone, and many others, Knockout.js. And basically with client-side rendering, we were generating these HTML components on the browser side. So we would have some JavaScript that would manipulate it on and build those HTML nodes we needed on top of a blank page. And then we also would have to have some specific routing mechanisms. So for React, it was React Router or remix router. So we would have some router mechanism that would be the same for Angular and etc. So that was the main server versus client thing. But then with the client side, with these client side technologies, we started having issues. For example, the time it took for the initial load. For example, a lot of things were really snappy because like really fast and felt immediate and etc. But initial load and other performance issues were a problem. We started to feel like, okay, this is not fun anymore. Now I have to think about where my user is, if they're loading my website from a bus in the middle of the city center and etc. So we start to think more and more about performance. And that's when we got what's called SSR, that is server-side rendering. But one of the things that I really like to emphasize, and I get a lot of questions about that, is we tend to think, and that's maybe on terminology, that SSR is equal to server rendering. But actually no, because with SSR, you're not server rendering. SSR, I mean, like Next.js before server components or any other traditional SSR strategy. So you're not server rendering things in the way you would do with Rails or Laravel or etc. back at the time. You're more like doing just-in-time pre-rendering. So that's why you cannot access the database in SSR. You can nowadays with server components in React, but so all of these static generation and SSR, they're both ahead of time and just in time, but client-side pre-rendering happening on the server. So as you can see, there's like a lot of possible combinations and etc.
There you touched on one kind of negative of rendering things on the client or rendering everything on the client is that it can really kind of kill your initial page load because you're basically sending just all of your data to the browser and letting your browser kind of handle all of that work, leading to kind of large initial load times. So I would say that's, to me, one of the kind of biggest negatives of doing all client-side rendering. But are there also kind of downsides to rendering things on the server? Or what are maybe some pros and cons between doing all of your rendering on the client versus maybe doing almost everything on the server? And I know it's kind of a loose term on the server. Like you kind of mentioned, you have rendering things at request time, but you also have rendering things at build time, and Next.js now has server components to make it a bit kind of easier to do some of these things. So maybe kind of, I know it's kind of a general hard question to answer, but what are some maybe pros and cons of a few of these different kind of rendering patterns?
Yeah, I actually kind of love this question because we start digging into this rabbit hole of hydration and other problems like what people call the uncanny valley. By the way, Ryan Corniato from Solid and also Mishko from Quick, they write a lot about that. But basically, with SSR, we started having performance issues when it comes to interactivity. Because basically, your server, like the server sends like the pre-built HTML and etc. But you don't have event listeners attached. These, like attaching event listeners to the components and etc., all of that happens with the hydration process. But the thing is, so you get a page and you see it because it's pre-rendered on the server. That's great. But the point is, you cannot interact with that because the browser might still be busy like loading, parsing, evaluating, and doing the whole JavaScript thing with the parts that have interactivity. So that's called, it's better when you can visualize that because they have like nice charts, but that's the uncanny valley. That is this specific slice where you cannot interact. So I think that this and other negative side effects of hydration that took us years to start addressing them with different approaches were one of the main problems with SSR. And that was one of them. From the perspective of someone building a framework or something like this, it was also tricky to remote libraries and etc. I remember when SSR started being a thing, it was really tricky to make your, I don't know, your style sheet library or your state management library, whatever it is, to work well on both ends. So I think you have a few cons depending on whether you are an application developer or someone working on tooling, but usually it goes like this.
Gotcha. And I think those are definitely good kind of main kind of pros and cons of each. And it does kind of make it a little bit tricky to have one kind of all together solution. But I know that there are now some frameworks that are giving you kind of better ways to handle these, like Next.js with server components and then kind of slotting in your client components where needed. Or you also have Quick that kind of uses the idea of resumability, which, to be honest, I haven't played around with Quick a ton. I just had one of their kind of developers on my podcast and talked with him about it, which is how I learned about it. But we're kind of getting these other solutions, but there's also kind of this idea of the edge. And I know you've kind of talked about this a bit as well. So my question kind of regarding this is, I feel like, maybe recently or within the last handful of years, this idea of the edge has kind of become maybe like the sexy new thing, kind of the new trend a bit. So first off, maybe what is the edge? And then does the edge kind of help solve some of these issues with kind of client and server rendering, or kind of what do you think about that?
Yeah. One of the things I love about the edge is that, like a lot of other of these concepts we discussed, the ideas for them, they have been around for a while now. It just took a while for them to get to our bubble. But for example, the idea of edge computing actually started back in the 90s with the idea of CDNs and serving things from closer to the user. So going a bit back, so let's think of the problems we have with cloud computing, for example. You first think of one of the things is latency, because there is a geographical distance between the users and the data centers. What we used to have in the past is few data centers in the US, Europe, Asia, and Americas, and that's pretty much it. So you have very few distributed, and then you kind of need to minimize the distance the data has to travel. So that's the idea of the edge. I admit it's a bit of a fuzzy term because I often hear people, okay, so the user, my computer, or the processor inside an IoT device, this could be the edge because that's the edge of the network. But at the same time, it could be your router, the ISP, or even a local edge server. So it's a bit of a fuzzy terminology, but the key takeaway here is the edge of the network is close to the device, unlike what you would have with Origin servers or even cloud servers.
Gotcha. So by kind of leveraging the edge or servers that are closer to your user, and rendering things there, you can potentially kind of decrease your latency a bit and improve your performance because you're just literally geographically closer to whatever user is using your product, and doing kind of your computation at that point is going to be better than maybe sending that data all the way across the wire, like geographically in a far location, and then sending it back and kind of doing that sort of thing. Am I understanding that correctly there?
Yeah, exactly. And it's great to visualize that. I don't remember the name of the blog post right now, but the folks from Dino, because now they have Dino deployed, they made I think it was a few years ago, comparing the same app, like the ping time to the same application in Heroku cloud centers and in their distributed edge network. And they were performing these pings from different locations and comparing the latencies. And it's just like... it screams in terms of performance. And then, we had CDNs and we used to deploy static resources to CDNs. We've been doing this for a while now. I think that what changed in the last few years, especially when we saw Cloudflare workers back in 2017, is that we got to smaller JavaScript runtimes that could be deployed to the edge network. So we got Dino runtime. Vercel has their edge runtime nowadays as well that is deployed to their edge network. So these are basically a subset of Node APIs that are smaller and can go to network, and then you can server-side render your stuff from the edge. So we're no longer just doing that with static assets and CDNs. We're doing that with deploying next to the edge or fresh, and all those.
Perfect. Well, I think that covers kind of server or rendering things on server on the edge, as well as server-side rendering and client-side rendering. But if we could maybe finish on just a couple of final questions here regarding maybe one, are there any common mistakes that developers tend to make when it comes to just rendering overall? Like maybe an idea I have in my head is maybe only focusing on rendering in one location. So just try to do everything client-side or just trying to do everything server-side and then kind of running into the cons of doing both. But what are maybe some common mistakes that developers might make or that they should be aware of when kind of thinking about rendering their applications?
Yeah, so I think that first we need to think of rendering patterns also architecture-wise. So we tend to think a lot that we're just doing things for the sake of performance and etc. But there's also the architecture standpoint. And one example is server components. So React server components are not only about performance and shipping zero JavaScript and that kind of stuff. They're also an architectural shift. So I think that the first mistake is these decisions, they will not only impact the UX to your users, specific performance, etc. They will also impact your developer experience. So I gave you the example of that startup that we suddenly had to change to Next because it was the cool thing back then, and etc. And I've also seen other examples. So I've worked in legacy code bases where you wouldn't have a React MPA. So it's not an SPA, it's an MPA because it's like a React app that has a Java backend serving and injecting data. And yeah, so I don't know, almost 10 years ago, that made sense to the team involved in building that and etc. But the point is, there was, again, in my opinion, a bad decision around rendering patterns that resulted in a terrible DX nowadays we have. And I think that another mistake is that it's the same ones that we get when we're talking about performance. So I remember that a few years ago, there was this tweet about this WordPress plugin that basically they were selling, okay, we're going to reduce your LCP, largest content footprint. But the thing is, someone started digging into that plugin that had millions of downloads, and basically they were not improving at all the actual user experience. So I think that a common mistake is we're more and more faking or gaming performance metrics, be it for the sake of SEO or to post your Lighthouse course on Twitter and etc. So I think that this is I think we should talk more about business impact of performance, of making the right decision on rendering pattern and etc. So talk about metrics like the time your users spend on your site or the bounce rate, conversion rates, revenue. There's a post, I don't remember the name, but it's by Philip Tallis. It's he talks a lot about performance and etc. And it's called I think the Matrix game or something like this, where he revisits the whole problem of pursuing metrics, pursuing performance without having the metrics and etc. So I think that's another common mistake.
Yeah, I really like that, as I totally agree that you can sometimes get caught in just gaming the numbers to, we improved it by 20%, but maybe you increase from 1.2 seconds to 1.1 seconds, and it doesn't have any meaningful impact for the actual user. So actually looking at, are they spending more time on your site? Are we seeing more purchases when they land on this page, or whatever it might be, are kind of good ways to go about it. But maybe as just one final question here, what are maybe some just final practical takeaways regarding what we discussed here that a developer can kind of keep in mind when they're actually creating their sites?
Cool. So the first one would be, let's talk business impact, actual impacts. Also, I think that we should always think in terms of both UX and developer experience. We should not tackle one and completely forget about the other. And like the examples I showed you that we just revamped things for the sake of UX and then the UX was terrible. And I think that we should always think in terms of what was there before. So that's one of the main takeaways from my session on the topic. There's this thing called Jaxer, and Jaxer, a lot of people have never heard of it, but it was back in 2008, and it was built on top of the Firefox engine, but it's like you took the browser away from Firefox, and you had some experience close to what you have with server components these days. And I'm talking more than a decade ago. And then in 2011, there was this language called OPA, that they would have a compiler slice some client and server code for you, and etc. So we're discussing a lot of code extraction, code collocation, how to do that with bundlers and etc. And there's a lot of prior art, and a lot of the key things we have into hydration, islands, etc. They were there before. So think about prior art and think about other ecosystems. I saw years ago this tweet by Andrew Clark. He's one of the core team guys, one of the guys in the core team of React. And he was talking about something called double buffering, which is a common technique in game development. And this technique has been there for decades. And React brings a lot of inspiration from double buffering into its reconciler algorithm, where you have good tree and work in progress tree. Same thing with progressive HTML rendering. You had Marco doing that back in 2014. And we're talking about progressive doing things in 2020. So a lot of things, they were there. They were just probably not properly sold, or they didn't have a great ecosystem, or they just needed some tackling to be proper technique. So yeah, look for other ecosystems, look for prior experiments on rendering, etc. That'll be it.
It's crazy how much of this stuff has already been done, but we're talking about how it's like the new fancy thing, and a lot of people are like, people were basically doing this like a decade ago, which is kind of crazy to think about. It seems to happen like in cycles as well, as where something comes in fashion, and then it goes out of fashion, and then it comes back in fashion, and
that's one of the things I emphasize a lot in my session. I show side-by-side snippets, for example, from server components in Jaxer, or posts from 2005 talking about progressively rendering HTML with streaming and all the cool stuff we have with React 18, for example. So yeah, it's just crazy how everything is cycling.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation here today, and if people want to kind of stay up to date with your doing, if they want to stay up to date with any talks that you give or any content that you're producing, where can they kind of go online to find you?
Yeah, so I'm online at ythecombinator.space, and you can find me everywhere, pretty much everywhere, Twitter, GitHub, whatever, at ythecombinator. So it's like Y, the actual letter, the combinator. It's like, I tried to make a pun with mathematics and etc., but it turned out to be something that I always have to explain, and no one gets the pun. So, but yeah, Y Combinator.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really enjoyed our discussion.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.